Imagine waking up from like an absolutely terrifying nightmare.
Oh, the worst feeling.
Right. Your heart is pounding, you are totally covered in sweat, and you turn to your partner to try and explain what just happened.
But you can't because the words just fail.
Exactly. The dream is already slipping away. It's turning into that vague, fuzzy feeling.
Yeah, you just can't hold on to it.
But now imagine if instead of struggling to describe it, you just pick up your phone, opened an app, and pressed play to actually show them the video feed of what you were just dreaming.
I mean, it sounds like pure science fiction, like a plot from some cyberpunk movie.
It really does. But we are not talking about science fiction today. We are talking about reality.
Yeah, the actual literal reality.
We are looking at the actual artificial intelligence currently being trained to decode the visual feed of human dreams directly from the brain. And honestly, that is just the beginning.
It is the absolute definition of a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
I mean, we're looking at a landscape where the camera is no longer pointed at the physical world.
Right.
The camera is pointed entirely inward. It's looking at our thoughts, our intentions, and, our subconscious.
So welcome to this deep dive. Today, we have a towering stack of sources to guide you through this shift.
A very heavy stack today.
Seriously. For you, the learner listening right now, whether you are prepping for a strategy meeting on emerging tech or tracking the investment landscape of neurobiology, or maybe you just possess this insatiable curiosity about exactly where the human mind meets the machine.
This deep dive is custom tailored for you.
Exactly. We are examining cutting-edge research papers on generative visual decoding.
We're also breaking down a highly detailed industry roadmap for high-volume brain-computer interface, or BCI, manufacturing slated for 2026.
And crucially, we are dissecting the legal and policy frameworks from Duke Law. They're addressing the emerging crisis of what experts are now calling mental privacy.
The convergence of these three fields, the AI software decoding the brain, the robotic hardware scaling the implants, and the legal scramble to protect our minds, it's happening at just a breakneck pace.
It's moving so fast. We are transitioning from theoretical neuroscience done in these massive laboratories to, mass-produced consumer hardware intended for everyday life.
Which is exactly what we need to get our heads around today.
So our mission for this deep dive is to explore the real-world applications of this visual decoding technology and these BCIs.
But we're going to understand the actual mechanics of how scientists are literally decoding dreams.
And we will explore how this technology is moving into automated, mass-produced physical implants. We'll look at the incredible medical breakthroughs this allows for treating severe trauma, too.
And, perhaps most urgently, we're going to look at the terrifying privacy implications of corporations owning our cognitive biometrics.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can even entertain the idea of putting hardware into people's brains on a mass scale, we really have to understand the software breakthroughs, right?
Oh, absolutely. The software that's making it possible to actually read the brain's signals in high fidelity.
Right, because for years, scientists have tried to decode brain activity into images using fMRI machines, and the results were, frankly, terrible.
Terrible is a very generous word.
They were just bad, right?
Oh, yeah. They were incredibly blurry, unrecognizable messes. They looked like static-filled blobs that barely resembled anything.
Let alone the image the person was actually looking at.
Exactly. And understanding exactly why those early attempts failed is the absolute key to understanding why the new modern methods are succeeding so brilliantly today.
Okay, let's dig into that failure. Why didn't the old way work?
Well, early attempts relied on what we call primitive linear models.
Okay.
The researchers would take handcrafted visual features from real-world images, things like multi-scale image bases or Gabor filters.
Wait, let me jump in there so we don't lose anyone in the technical weeds. A Gabor filter in early computer vision is basically just a math equation used to detect edges, right?
Yeah, pretty much.
It looks for lines and boundaries in an image.
That is correct. It's a very rigid mathematical way to identify an edge or a texture. So the old models would take the fMRI data, specifically the voxel space, and try to draw a straight, linear mathematical map directly to those simple edge-detecting features.
And for you listening, whenever we talk about brain scans today, keep the word voxel in mind. A voxel is essentially a 3D pixel.
Right, a volumetric pixel.
When you look at an fMRI scan, the brain is divided up into these tiny little three-dimensional cubes of tissue.
And that fMRI is measuring the BOLD signal, the blood oxygen level dependent signal.
Because neurons don't store their own energy, right?
Exactly. When a specific cluster of neurons in your brain fires because you are looking at, say, an apple, they suddenly need energy, so blood rushes to that tiny cube of tissue.
Oh, okay.
The fMRI uses massive magnets to detect the difference between oxygen-rich blood and oxygen-depleted blood.
Yeah.
That tells us which voxels, which tiny cubes of your brain, are actively working at any given millisecond.
So, if I understand the failure of the old models correctly, they were taking these active 3D pixels of blood flow in the brain and trying to draw a straight line to simple math equations that detect edges.
Which is a fundamental misunderstanding of how the human brain actually works.
Right.
Human vision does not operate in straight lines. It is not a simple one-to-one mapping from your eyeball to a static picture in your head. It is a deeply complex, hierarchical pipeline.
Which brings us to the massive breakthrough detailed in one of our source papers, generative decoding of visual stimuli.
Yes, this is where it gets really cool.
The researchers looked at the blurry blobs from the old AI models and realized the AI was completely ignoring biological reality.
They realized they needed to look at the two streams hypothesis of the human visual cortex.
Let's trace that. What happens when you look at something?
Okay, light hits your retina. That signal travels to the very back of your brain, to the primary visual cortex, which neuroscientists call V1.
B1. Got it.
This is the absolute low-level processing center. V1 is where your brain perceives the rawest materials of vision, basic orientations, simple edges, contrasting lines.
So it's the structural foundation, just the lines and angles.
Yes. From there, the signal cascades forward into mid-level processing areas, known as V2, V3, and V4.
What happens there?
Here, the brain starts assembling those raw lines into shapes and adding color information. And finally, the signal reaches the high-level processing areas in the deeper parts of the brain.
And these areas are highly specialized, right?
Incredibly specialized. For example, you have the fusiform face area, or FFA, that selectively lights up only when you process a human face.
Oh, wow.
You also have the lateral occipital complex, or LOC, which processes distinct objects, and the parahippocampal place area, or PPA, which processes environments, rooms, and landscapes.
So biological vision is a strict sequential pipeline.
Exactly.
You can't process a face in the FFA until V1 has processed the edges that make up the jawline and the eyes.
It's a biological assembly line.
Okay, I love this analogy. Think about a physical factory assembly line.
Right.
If you want to build a car, you have a specific order of operations. You stamp the steel, you weld the frame, you add the doors, drop in the engine, and finally, you paint it.
You can't skip steps.
No. But the old AI models were basically taking all the brain data from every part of the visual cortex, throwing it into a generic algorithmic blender, and asking the machine to output a car.
Yeah, they were dumping raw steel, rubber, and glass into a giant pile and hoping for a Mercedes.
If an AI doesn't know that the raw steel, which is the V1 edge data from the back of the brain, needs to be shaped before it becomes a car door, the LOC object data, it's going to fail.
It's going to build a blurry blob.
That is the perfect way to visualize it. So what did the researchers in this paper do to fix this?
Well, they built a totally new neural network architecture called a hierarchical variational autoencoder, or HVAE.
Okay, HVAE.
Now, a standard autoencoder compresses data down into a bottleneck, a latent space, and tries to reconstruct it. But instead of a generic single-layer latent space, these researchers forced the AI's internal architecture to physically mirror the biological assembly line of the human brain.
Wait, they made the software mimic the wetware.
They did. They mapped the fMRI voxels from the early stages of the biological visual pathway, V1, V2, V3, exclusively to the first shallow set of variables in the AI.
Okay.
Then they mapped the brain's higher visual areas, the LOC for objects, the PPA for places, exclusively to the deeper, more complex layers in the AI's hierarchy.
So by forcing the AI to process the data in the exact same sequential order that the human brain processes reality, they cracked the code.
They completely cracked it.
The decoded images suddenly went from those terrible blurry blobs to crystal clear, highly accurate pictures of what the person was actually looking at.
The fidelity is truly astonishing. And they proved it wasn't a fluke through what we call an ablation study.
Let's define that for you listening. When you read a research paper and they mention an ablation study, what are they actually doing?
An ablation study is a method where you systematically remove or disable certain parts of an AI model to see what is actually driving its performance.
So it's like pulling spark plugs out of an engine one by one to see which cylinder is misfiring.
That's a great way to put it. In this case, the researchers took their hierarchical model and temporarily flattened it. They tried mapping all the brain voxels to a single AI layer, what they call the naive baseline.
They went back to the giant pile of car parts.
And the performance instantly tanked. It
Yeah.
went right back to generating blurry blobs.
Wow.
But when they reactivated the split pathways, mimicking the human dorsal and ventral streams, the image fidelity skyrocketed back up. It definitively proved that mimicking the biological structure is the key to visual decoding.
Which is mind-blowing on its own. I mean, we can put a waking person in an fMRI, show them a picture of an airplane, and the AI can pull a recognizable image of an airplane out of their brainwaves.
It's incredible.
But the sources don't stop there. They take this a massive, almost terrifying step further. They transition from decoding waking life to decoding dreams.
Yes. The paper Decoding the Dreams into a Coherent Video Story pushes this entire field into completely uncharted territory.
But decoding dreams has to present a massive logistical hurdle, right? I mean, the problem of data scarcity.
Oh, massive. Because you can't exactly ask someone to sleep on command inside a screaming loud magnetic tube.
Right. fMRI machines are incredibly noisy.
Finding the data is incredibly difficult. You can only collect sleep data when participants naturally fall into the correct sleep stages inside the fMRI. And even then, you have to rely entirely on their subjective, groggy, verbal recall when you wake them up to have any idea what you were looking at.
You just have to trust them.
Right. Furthermore, you lack the objective ground truth. In a waking experiment, you know exactly what the subject is looking at because you put the picture of the airplane on a screen in front of them. You can check the AI's work.
But in a dream, the image only exists inside their head. You have no reference image to train the AI against.
Exactly. You can't just plug a USB drive into their temple and download the raw MP4 file of the dream to train your model.
So if you don't have the baseline data, how do you train an AI to decode a dream?
You use a technique called transfer learning, and it relies on a deeply fascinating neurological phenomenon.
Okay, what is it?
Waking visual experiences and dreaming visual experiences fundamentally share activation patterns in the visual cortex.
Wait, really? The exact same physical hardware in my brain lights up in the exact same way whether I am physically looking at a cat walking across my living room or if I am fast asleep dreaming about a cat.
The patterns are remarkably homologous. The brain utilizes the same visual assembly line to render a dream that it uses to process waking reality.
That is wild.
So the researchers capitalize on this. They train their multi-subject fMRI to image model using something called the Natural Scenes Dataset, or NSD.
Let's break that down.
Yeah.
What is the NSD?
The NSD is a massive, publicly available dataset of high-resolution fMRI data collected from subjects who are wide awake, looking at tens of thousands of real-world images.
And those images are pulled from the MS-SOCO dataset, right?
Exactly.
MS-SOCO, I've seen that acronym in AI papers. It stands for Microsoft Common Objects in Context. It's basically an enormous library of everyday photos that have been painstakingly labeled by humans. This is a dog, this is a frisbee, this is a car.
Precisely. So the researchers take this massive library of waking brain data paired with labeled images, and they train the AI.
Okay, so the model is learning the assembly line.
Yes. The model learns exactly how the biological assembly line reacts to thousands of different visual stimuli. Once the model is highly robust and fully trained on waking perception, they perform the transfer. They point the trained model at the sleep state fMRI data.
So that is step one of their process, reconstructing visual stimulus perception, getting the AI smart enough on waking data. Then comes step two, decoding dream visual imagery. They take the continuous stream of sleep fMRI data, break it down into very specific time windows, like pulling individual frames from a roll of film and run those snapshots through the model.
And the model spits out discrete, individual images representing what the visual cortex was rendering during that exact millisecond of sleep.
Which is just a monumental leap forward.
Previous methods of dream decoding, which were heralded as breakthroughs just a few years ago, could only achieve semantic category-level classification.
Meaning they could only give you text. They could say, the subject is likely dreaming about an animal or a building.
Right. They were just text-based classifiers. This new generative method actually produces the visual rendering of the animal or the building they were dreaming about.
But here is the massive catch. Dreams are not slideshows.
No, they are not.
They are not discrete, disconnected Polaroid pictures. Dreams are movies. They flow, they shift, they have a bizarre fluid continuity to them.
They really do.
So the researchers have all these isolated, decoded snapshots of a dream. How do they weave those static images into a moving narrative?
This brings us to step 3 of the paper. Dream narrative integration. And I have to admit, this is where the methodology gets a little wild.
Yeah, because they use large language models to do the weaving, right?
They essentially use AI as a bridge between the fragments.
Okay, how does that process work?
First, they use an image-text question answering model called LEN-NS. They feed each individual decoded dream snapshot into Lens and ask it to generate a highly detailed textual description or a caption for that specific frame.
So now we have a stack of text captions describing the raw dream images.
Next, they take all of those sequential text captions and feed them into a powerful large language model like ChatGPT.
And what do they ask it to do?
They use a very specific prompt. They explicitly ask the LLM to act as a dream interpreter and a scriptwriter.
A scriptwriter.
Yeah. The LLM's job is to look at the sequential captions, connect the dots, and write a logically coherent narrative script that possesses a dreamlike storytelling style.
Wow.
Finally, they take that LLM-generated script, pair it back with the original decoded images, and feed the whole package into text-to-video diffusion models to generate a smooth, continuous, rendered video story.
Okay, I have to push back hard on this step. I read this part of the source material, and it really gave me pause.
I'm not surprised it's controversial.
Think about it. We know that dreams are naturally disjointed, chaotic, and often completely devoid of waking logic.
Absolutely.
An LLM, by its very design, is a prediction engine built to generate the next most logical word. It is designed to create coherent, human-sounding text.
That's its entire purpose.
So if we are taking the chaotic, fragmented visual static of a dream and using an LLM to force a logical, coherent narrative onto it, how much of this final decoded dream video is actually the human being's authentic experience? And how much is the AI simply hallucinating a story to make us feel better?
That is the most profound question you could ask about this research.
Because are we actually decoding a dream, or are we just projecting our desperate human desire for narrative structure onto neurological static?
It is a phenomenal point of pushback, because what's fascinating here is that what you are pointing out highlights the massive philosophical gap between raw neurophysiological data, the biology, and subjective human experience consciousness.
Right.
It forces us to ask a really uncomfortable question. What actually is a dream?
Is a dream the raw, fragmented, chaotic imagery flashing through your visual cortex while you are paralyzed in REM sleep?
Or is a dream the narrative that your waking, conscious brain desperately imposes on those chaotic fragments the split second you wake up, trying to make sense of the madness?
Wow. If I wake up and say, I had a dream I was flying over a city and then the city turned into a forest, did I actually experience a continuous narrative of flying, or did my brain just fire a city voxel followed by a forest voxel, and my waking mind stitched it together into a story of flight?
The researchers themselves note this exact conundrum in the paper. It is notoriously challenging for participants to provide precise, chronological descriptions of their dreams upon waking.
Yeah, the memories just fade instantly.
Their memories are fragmented and highly susceptible to suggestion. What the LLM might actually be doing in this step is not hallucinating a fake story. It might be perfectly mimicking the very process our own waking consciousness uses to construct a memory of a dream.
We impose narrative on chaos.
We do. And the AI is simply doing that exact same cognitive process, but doing it externally on a server.
That is deeply unsettling, but totally fascinating. It means the AI isn't just decoding the dream, it's replicating the human act of remembering.
It is a mirror reflecting our own cognitive processes back at us.
Okay, so we have established the software is here. We can map the biological assembly line. We can decode the visual feed. We can reconstruct waking vision. And we are on the verge of mapping sleep vision.
Yes.
But doing this currently requires the subject to be shoved inside a massive multi-million-dollar supercooled fMRI tube.
Which isn't exactly practical for daily use.
Exactly. For this visual decoding technology to have any real-world daily application for you or me, it has to get out of the laboratory. It has to become portable.
Ultimately, it has to be implanted.
Which brings us directly to the physical hardware scaling, specifically our industry source, Neuralink's 2026 high-volume brain implant plan.
Reading minds in a lab is an incredible scientific achievement. But scaling that capability to thousands and potentially millions of people requires an industrial revolution in medtech.
The source outlines an aggressive roadmap aiming for high-volume BCI production and fully automated surgical implantation by the year 2026.
That is a very tight timeline.
Let's put that in context. That is a massive leap from where the industry was even in 2024 when they were celebrating very limited single-digit human trials.
To understand the sheer scale of what they are attempting, you have to look at the automation challenge.
Right.
You absolutely cannot mass produce and mass implant brain-computer interfaces by hand. Human surgeons, no matter how skilled, are a bottleneck.
And human hands are simply not steady enough for the density of the electrodes required.
Not even close. The source details the necessary transition from manual insertions to a fully autonomous, AI-guided robotic cell.
And we are not talking about a robot building a car door. The physical tolerances required here are mind-boggling.
Oh, insane.
The robotic actuation requires sub-millimeter accuracy and force sensing below 0.1 newtons.
Let me explain why that specific number, 0.1 newtons, is so critical. The human brain is not a solid muscle. It has the consistency of warm gelatin.
Oh, wow. Okay.
It is incredibly fragile. You can't just jab a rigid needle into it. You will cause massive hemorrhaging and tissue scarring, and that scarring ruins the electrical signal.
So the robot has to be unbelievably gentle.
The robot has to insert threads that are thinner than a human hair, and it has to sense the microscopic resistance to the tissue so it doesn't tear a capillary.
And to make it even harder, the target isn't sitting still.
Yeah.
It's not at all. The robot uses a preoperative MRI and CT scans to map out safe insertion paths, planning a 3D route to weave the electrodes through the cortex without hitting major blood vessels.
But the brain is a dynamic, living organ. It shifts inside the skull, doesn't it?
Constantly.
Yeah.
Every time the patient's heart beats, the entire brain pulsates. Every time they take a breath, it moves.
So a pre-planned map is useless the second the surgery starts.
Exactly. So the surgical robot uses highly advanced, real-time machine vision algorithms. It watches the surface of the brain with high-speed cameras, tracks the pulsation of the veins, and continuously updates its 3D insertion trajectory on the fly.
Wow, so it's compensating for that brain shift in real time.
It's threading a microscopic needle into a moving target.
And the manufacturing of the computer chips themselves is just as intense. The source details the factory side of this 2026 plan. We are talking about allowable manufacturing errors of less than 50 nanometers. Yes, moving to high-volume production requires fully automated mask alignment systems with submicron precision. And to ensure that quality at scale, they have to use what is called in situ metrology.
I saw those terms in the paper, scatterometry and ellipsometry.
Yeah, heavy jargon.
For those of us who don't run semiconductor fabrication plants, what do those words mean?
They are highly advanced optical measurement techniques. Essentially, as the robot is building the microscopic layers of the brain chip, it shines specialized polarized light lasers onto the surface of the silicon wafer.
Okay, shooting lasers at the chip.
By measuring exactly how that light scatters and reflects off the material, the system can calculate the thickness of the layers down to the atomic level.
Atomic level precision.
If scatterometry detects that a layer of polymer is, say, 10 nanometers too thick during deposition, the AI-driven feedback loop instantly adjusts the chemical process for the next chip.
That's unbelievable.
This is state-of-the-art semiconductor manufacturing precision, historically reserved for making smartphone processors, now being applied directly to neurobiology.
But here's where it gets really interesting for me. We all know the medical therapeutic side of this. The media loves to cover it, and rightfully so.
Using BCIs to treat ALS, bypassing severed spinal cords to restore movement?
Exactly. Or directly stimulating the visual cortex to restore sight to the blind. That is miraculous stuff.
Truly.
But the Neuralink 2026 roadmap explicitly outlines the jump beyond medicine. They are targeting consumer, real-world applications. They are building the infrastructure for consumer augmentation.
It is the inevitable trajectory of the technology.
Yeah.
Once the safety profiles are proven and the regulatory frameworks mature, the clean slate hardware that Neuralink is building, these high-bandwidth, wireless, implantable computers, will inevitably target non-medical markets.
The source lists several near-term consumer applications that will completely change how we interact with technology.
Oh yeah, one major focus is using BCIs for the neural control of augmented and virtual reality environments.
Think about that for a second. Right now, if you put on an AR headset, you have to hold clunky plastic controllers.
Or you have to wave your hands around in the air doing awkward pinch gestures so the cameras can see you clicking a virtual menu.
It's tedious. The BCI eliminates the physical bottleneck entirely.
Completely. You would navigate the operating system entirely through thought gestures.
Thought gestures. That's a wild phrase.
You look at a virtual application, intend to open it, and the motor cortex command is intercepted by the implant and executed by the headset instantly.
It creates a seamless, zero-latency mixture of physical reality and virtual reality.
The source also mentions memory augmentation and focused attention modulation.
How does that work?
This relies on the BCI's ability to read your brain's continuous state. By tracking your real-time neural oscillatory patterns, specifically looking at the balance of your alpha, beta, and gamma brainwaves, the system can objectively recognize the exact moment your cognitive focus begins to slip.
It knows you are distracted before you do. So I'm sitting at my desk reading a dense report. My mind starts to wander to what I'm having for dinner. The implant detects the drop in beta waves and triggers a subtle biofeedback response.
Maybe an auditory cue in your earpiece, or a slight change in the lighting of your AR glasses.
Just to pull my attention back to the text, it's like an automated focus assistant living in my cortex.
Yes. But then there is the most speculative and arguably most disruptive application listed in the consumer roadmap: telepathic brain-to-brain communication.
I read that and had to read it twice. How does that even work practically?
A brain-to-brain communication prototype would involve two individuals, both with high-bandwidth networked implants.
Okay, two people wired up.
The BCI would encode the neural signals associated with a specific intention, concept, or even a visualized image using the visual decoding models we just discussed.
Right, the HVAs.
It transmits that encoded data package over a network to the second person's implant, which then stimulates their cortex to reproduce the concept,
Bypassing the mouth and the ears entirely.
The source suggests this could revolutionize professional environments. Imagine a rapid-fire design session between two architects.
Okay.
Instead of trying to verbally describe a complex 3D structure, one architect simply visualizes it. The implant decodes the visual assembly line and transmits the 3D model directly to the other architect's AR headset.
Or directly into their visual cortex.
Exactly. It completely bypasses the incredibly slow, lossy bottleneck of spoken human language. It allows for the instantaneous exchange of raw conceptual thought.
It's breathtaking. But here's the thing. While invasive surgical implants like Neuralink are scaling up their robotics for 2026, we don't actually have to wait 3 years to see the real-world impact of brain-computer interfaces.
No, we really don't.
We don't need automated drills. We are already seeing a quiet revolution in non-invasive brain tech happening right now, particularly in the therapeutic space for severe trauma.
This is a vital counterweight to the invasive implant discussion. The International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies, or ISSS, recently published poster abstracts that provide an incredible window into this.
Yeah, showing how non-invasive interfaces, headsets, eye trackers, audio processors are currently being deployed in clinics as both objective diagnostic tools and direct active treatments.
Let's talk about eye tracking first.
Yeah, because if you ask the average person what eye tracking is for, they'll say it's a way for advertisers to see which part of a web page you look at so they can serve you a better ad.
But one of the ISTSS posters, Abstract 1789, shows how eye tracking is graduating from a marketing tool into a critical neurodiagnostic biomarker.
How are they using it clinically?
The poster details how clinical researchers are using high-resolution eye tracking to reliably discriminate between healthy individuals, patients suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder, and patients with traumatic brain injury, or TBI.
Okay.
They put patients through standardized visual tasks and found highly significant measurable differences in their microsaccades.
Microsaccades. Those are the tiny involuntary movements of the eye, right?
Exactly. And they also look at their overall executive functioning performance.
If you think about it, that makes perfect biological sense. If your internal visual decoding system, your biological assembly line is stuck in a state of hypervigilance because of severe trauma, constantly scanning for threats.
Your physical eye movements are going to inevitably reflect that underlying neural reality.
Precisely. And what makes this so revolutionary is that it provides an objective, quantifiable biomarker for psychiatric conditions.
Which is huge, because historically, diagnosing PTSD or TBI relied heavily on subjective self-reporting.
A doctor asks, "How anxious do you feel on a scale of 1 to 10? The patient just guesses.
With eye tracking, the doctor doesn't have to ask. The nervous system reveals the trauma objectively through the biomechanics of the eye.
But identifying the trauma is only half the battle. The interventions, the actual treatment described in these sources, are even more fascinating.
Oh, absolutely.
Let's look at Abstract 150. It details a randomized controlled trial of something called allostatic neurotechnology, used to treat mild traumatic brain injury in a military population.
This is the acoustic echoing trial, and the clinical results they recorded were nothing short of staggering.
Let's walk through it. Patients with mild TBI were brought in and listened to an acoustic echoing program for roughly 10 one-hour sessions.
Right?
The tones they were listening to through the headphones weren't just a Spotify relaxation playlist or random whale sounds.
No, no.
The audio was being generated in real time by a computer to perfectly reflect their own brain's electrical activity.
And the preliminary results showed that their neurobehavioral symptom inventory scores, which measure things like dizziness, memory loss, and severe headaches, dropped drastically.
From an average baseline of 43.4 down to 23.2.
In clinical terms, a 20-point drop on the NSI is a massive, life-altering improvement in daily functioning.
So let me get this straight. We're essentially putting EEG sensors on a traumatized patient's head, reading the chaotic, damaged electrical signals of their brain, turning those exact chaotic signals into audio tones, and playing their brain's own chaotic music back to it, and that helps it heal.
It does.
How does that actually work mechanically? I mean, on the surface, it sounds a bit like holistic magic.
It sounds like it, but it is entirely grounded in physics and neurology. To understand the mechanism, you have to understand that a healthy human brain operates on a highly complex, synchronized symphony of neural oscillations.
Okay, brainwaves.
We are talking about brain waves pulsing at various specific frequencies.
Yeah.
When someone suffers a traumatic physical brain injury or severe psychological trauma, those synchronized oscillations get physically disrupted.
So the rhythm gets thrown off.
You often see abnormally high electrical amplitudes stuck at certain frequencies. The brain falls entirely out of its natural rhythm and gets stuck in a loop.
It's like a feedback loop in a microphone system. You know when someone points a microphone at a speaker and it creates that awful, deafening screech?
Yes, perfect analogy.
The brain is screaming and it's picking up its own scream, creating a continuous loop of dysregulation.
That is exactly what's happening. Acoustic echoing is what we call a closed-loop BCI. The sensors read the electrical activity, instantly translate those specific dysregulated screeching oscillations into auditory tones, and feed them back into the patient's ears in a matter of milliseconds.
Okay, but why does hearing the screech help?
Because the brain is, fundamentally, an incredibly adaptive, dynamic, self-tuning system. When the brain hears its own dysregulation perfectly mirrored in the audio, when it hears the exact frequency of the microphone feedback, it naturally and instinctively attempts to correct the error.
It recognizes the screech.
Yes, it is an auditory form of neurofeedback. The brain recognizes the error in the mirror of the sound and activates its internal dampening systems to tune itself back into homeostasis.
That's just incredible.
This represents a total paradigm shift in psychiatric care. We're moving away from traditional talk therapy, which relies on conscious processing, or chemical medication, which floods the entire brain with drugs.
Instead, we are treating the brain as an oscillating physical system that can automatically autocorrect if it is simply given the right real-time sensory feedback.
That is incredibly elegant. And the real-world trauma applications in these sources go far beyond just audio feedback.
Right, the posters mention the use of immersive virtual environments as exposure therapy. For example, they are prototyping fully interactive, 360-degree video and 3D virtual reality simulations of a crowded grocery store to treat severe social anxiety in combat veterans.
You put the headset on, and you are instantly immersed in the trigger environment, but in a totally controlled, safe, clinical setting.
The sources also detail the 3MDR system. This stands for Emotion-Assisted Memory Desensitization and Reconsolidation.
That one is fascinating. Patients walk on a treadmill while interacting with trauma-related images in a virtual environment. They're combining this immersive physical movement therapy with CBTI.
Let's define CBTI for the listener. That's cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, right?
Correct. Severe trauma almost always destroys sleep architecture. CBTI is a structured program that helps patients identify and replace thoughts and behaviors that cause or worsen sleep problems.
So by combining the physical VR treadmill therapy, the 3MDR, to process the trauma during the day, with CBTI to repair the sleep architecture at night, they're attacking the trauma from both ends of the circadian rhythm.
Exactly. And it scales all the way down to the phone in your pocket. The sources note the use of mobile cognitive training apps specifically designed to target working memory deficits in patients suffering from co-occurring alcohol use disorder and PTSD.
What ties all of these therapeutic approaches together is the concept of the interface. We are using external digital environments, VR headsets, specialized acoustic algorithms, mobile applications to directly interface with, measure, and fundamentally alter the internal neural environment.
We are bridging the gap between the digital world and the biological mind to facilitate healing.
But bridging that gap, whether it's an acoustic echoing headset in a clinic or an Apple Vision Pro in your living room, requires data. Massive, continuous, incredibly intimate streams of data.
And that's where the conversation gets very dark very fast.
We have established that the technology can decode the visual feed of your dreams. It can seamlessly control AR interfaces by reading your motor cortex. It can objectively track your PTSD triggers through your involuntary eye movements and monitor your neural oscillations to tune your brainwaves.
It can do all of that.
The obvious and frankly terrifying question that arises from all of this capability is, who owns all of this data?
This is exactly where we must shift our focus away from the science and toward the legal and policy frameworks. Specifically, the deeply concerning analysis provided in the Deke Law paper, Beyond Neural Data, Cognitive Biometrics and Mental Privacy.
Yeah, let's get into the Deke Law paper.
The central foundational argument of this legal paper is that our current definitions of privacy are dangerously, perhaps catastrophically, inadequate for the technology that is arriving right now.
They argue that legal frameworks must urgently shift away from protecting what we call neural data to a much broader, much more encompassing category that they have termed cognitive biometrics.
Yes, that distinction is absolutely critical.
Let's break that distinction down because it feels like the crux of the whole privacy debate. Why is the term neural data not a good enough shield to protect us?
Because legally, neural data usually refers specifically to the direct, raw measurement of central nervous system activity. It's a scientific, clinical term.
Right.
It covers the data coming out of an EEG cap in a hospital, or an fMRI machine, or a Neuralink implant directly tapped into the cortex.
So if a law protects neural data, it only protects me if someone has a wire physically touching my head.
Exactly. But in the modern consumer Internet of Things landscape, tech companies do not need a surgical brain implant to infer exactly what you're thinking or feeling.
Right, because of what we just discussed with the trauma treatments. They don't need to look at your brain if they can just look at your eyes.
Precisely. The concept of cognitive biometrics encompasses a vastly wider net. It includes not just direct brain waves, but heart rate variability from your smartwatch, eye tracking data from your VR headset,
Microscopic facial expression analysis from your laptop camera?
galvanic skin response, which is how much you sweat from a fitness ring. It includes anything that, when processed by advanced machine learning, can be reliably used to infer your mental states.
The paper categorizes these mental states into 3 buckets, which I found really helpful. They talk about cognitive states, affective states, and conative states. Can you unpack those for the listener?
Certainly. Cognitive states refer to your active thought processes. Are you paying attention? Are you confused? Are you experiencing cognitive overload while reading a document?
Okay, so that's cognitive. What about affective?
Affective states refer to your emotional reality. Are you secretly anxious? Are you angry? Are you sexually aroused by what you are looking at?
And conative states.
Conative states refer to your hidden intentions and desires.
Mhm.
What are you planning to do next? What do you secretly want?
So if I am sitting on my couch wearing a standard smartwatch that tracks my pulse, and I'm wearing an AR headset that tracks exactly where my pupils dilate and what virtual objects I linger on, that combination of signals is generating cognitive biometric data.
It absolutely is.
No?
And here is why that is so dangerous. Raw data, like a single eye movement to the left or a slight elevation in your heartbeat, has no intrinsic meaning on its own. It's just a biological metric.
Right.
But when those metrics are fed into advanced AI algorithms, the data gains what the Deke Law authors call semantic value.
Let me offer an analogy here. Think about a smudge of ink on a piece of paper. An ink smudge means absolutely nothing. It's just a chemical.
Right.
But when you organize thousands of those ink smudges into specific shapes, they become letters, words, and sentences. They suddenly convey deep, profound meaning.
That is exactly what the AI is doing. The AI organizes our biological smudges, our microsweats, our pupil dilations, our heartbeats into deep, highly accurate insights about our pre-behavioral processes.
The algorithm can reveal what we are going to do or exactly how we feel before we even consciously register those feelings ourselves.
It knows you are angry before you realize you are clenching your jaw. And the corporate world, the tech giants building these headsets and watches, are acutely aware of the financial value of this semantic data.
Yeah, let me share some absolutely terrifying statistics directly from the source material. The Neurorights Foundation conducted a massive 2024 audit of the privacy policies of consumer neurotech companies currently on the market.
And the findings of that audit were incredibly stark.
Listen to these numbers. 96.7% of the neurotech companies audited reserved the legal right to transfer your brain data and cognitive biometrics to third parties.
Almost all of them.
Less than 20% of these companies even bother to mention encryption in their user policies. And a mere 16.7% legally commit to notifying you if your brain data is stolen in a server breach.
It's just wild.
We're talking about the most intimate, revealing data imaginable. The literal source code of your consciousness and the industry security standards are significantly lower than what you would expect from a basic free email provider.
This absolute lack of regulation allows for a deeply invasive practice called biometric psychography.
Biometric psychography.
Yes. Because cognitive biometrics are so deeply intertwined with our inner subconscious lives, they act as highly reliable proxies for incredibly sensitive personal information that you would never willingly type into a web form.
The sources gave some wild examples of this. What can these companies actually figure out about us just by watching our biological exhaust?
Peer-reviewed research has already demonstrated that analyzing simple EEG data while a subject looks at images can reliably reveal an individual's sexual orientation.
Wait, really? Just from EE?
Yes. And eye tracking data, simply observing the specific patterns of how someone scans an everyday scene, can be used to accurately predict core personality traits like neuroticism or extroversion.
That is crazy.
Even resting state EEG, just taking a baseline reading of a calm brain, can indicate a history of past drug use or alcohol abuse.
Wait, let me process that. My eye movements, as I look around a virtual menu in a video game headset, could generate enough data for a company to accurately profile my personality type and sell that profile to an advertiser.
Yes. And when the companies start combining these biometrics with contextual data, the profiling gets exponentially more invasive.
Give me an example of that.
Imagine a company pairs your heart rate variability from your watch with your precise GPS location data and logs exactly what advertisement you were looking at in your AR headset at that exact second.
Oh, no.
By fusing those data streams, they can precisely measure your involuntary emotional arousal to specific environmental triggers.
They can map exactly what pushes my buttons.
They can uncover biological proxies for your PN numbers, your banking details, your hidden romantic attractions, your hidden biases, and your skill levels in various tasks.
This is an absolute goldmine for the advertising technology industry. They no longer have to build probabilistic models to guess what you might want to buy. Your own nervous system simply bypasses your conscious filter and tells them directly.
For the advertising industry, it's the holy grail. But for individual mental privacy, it is a dystopian nightmare.
So given these massive gaping privacy holes, how do we legally regulate something as intimate as our own thoughts? Especially when the very devices we are buying, the Neuralink implants for productivity or the AR headsets for work, literally demand this constant stream of biometric data just to function properly.
The Duke Law paper points out a massive structural legislative gap in how we currently handle privacy. Current data protection laws are what the authors describe as overspecified and under-inclusive.
Okay, what does that mean?
Take the California Consumer Privacy Act, the CCPA, or the Illinois Biometric Information Privacy Act, known as BIPA. These are considered landmark privacy laws, but they were built for an older era of data collection. They were built for facial recognition and fingerprint scanning.
But wait, didn't the state of Colorado just pass a brand new, first-of-its-kind law specifically designed to protect brain data? I remember seeing the headlines about that.
They did pass it. And while it is certainly a step in the right direction for awareness, it illustrates this exact legislative gap perfectly.
How so?
Colorado's new law amends the definition of sensitive data to include biological data tied directly to the central nervous system. However, the law explicitly excludes things like eye tracking or facial recognition if that data is being used to infer a mental state, provided it's not being used for the specific purpose of identification.
Oh, I see the loophole. Let me make sure I have this right. So if a massive tech conglomerate is tracking my pupil dilation in their headset to figure out exactly what political ads make me emotionally angry, they aren't using my eye data to identify me as John Doe.
Right, they don't need to.
They already know I'm John Doe because I'm logged into the headset. They're just using the data to psychologically profile me. So because they aren't identifying me, the Colorado brain data law doesn't protect my eye tracking data at all.
Precisely. The law is dangerously under-inclusive because it focuses entirely on the physical source of the data, the brain itself, or the traditional use of biometrics proving identity. It completely ignores the inference that the data enables.
That is exactly why the authors argue the legal shift to the broader term cognitive biometrics is so critical.
We need a technology-neutral approach. A law should protect your mental privacy, regardless of whether the sensor reading your mind is surgically implanted in your motor cortex, strapped to your wrist, or shining a tiny infrared light at your pupils.
Okay, so we currently have a massive legal failure, or at least a lag in the law catching up to the tech. While we wait for Congress to figure out what a voxel is there a technological solution? Can we build privacy directly into the hardware?
The sources mention something called edge computing as a potential architectural savior here.
Edge computing, I've heard that buzzword. What does it actually mean for my brain data?
Edge computing is indeed a major systemic architectural shift in how hardware processes data. In the old model, the cloud computing model, your device would take all your raw cognitive biometric data, your continuous high-definition EEG brainwaves, your millisecond by millisecond eye-tracking coordinates, and stream all of that raw data up to a massive corporate cloud server.
And then the server does the heavy processing, figures out what you want to do, and sends the command back.
Exactly. Which means the corporation has a perfect, permanent copy of your raw brain activity sitting on their servers.
Edge computing flips that.
Yes. Instead of sending the raw data away, the heavy AI processing happens on the edge, meaning the processing happens on the physical silicon chip located inside the device you are wearing.
So the headset itself does the thinking locally, right on your face?
Yes. We are already seeing this implemented in high-end consumer hardware. Devices like the Apple Vision Pro and the Magic Leap 2 utilize edge computing specifically for their eye tracking systems.
Oh, really?
The raw, incredibly sensitive camera feeds watching your pupils never leave the physical headset. The on-device processor analyzes the raw video, figures out that you are trying to select an app icon, and only transmits that final sanitized inference, the action of the click, to the application.
That is a huge distinction. The raw data, the biological smudges, never goes to the corporate servers.
Exactly.
That severely limits the risk of a third-party data broker performing biometric psychography on your eye movements, because they only ever receive the final command, not the raw mechanics of how your eye got there.
It does limit the risk. It perfectly aligns with the cybersecurity principle of data minimization. Only collect the exact data you need to execute the function and nothing more. However, edge computing alone is not a silver bullet, because the hardware manufacturer still controls the edge processor. They could easily design the local chip to extract sensitive psychological insights locally and quietly transmit those specific insights back to base, rather than the raw data.
So the privacy is still reliant on trusting the hardware vendor.
Sadly, yes.
So, if edge computing is only a partial fix, what does this all mean? How do we actually build a comprehensive framework that protects the sanctity of our own minds?
The authors of the Duke Law paper propose establishing what they call a privacy floor. This echoes international recommendations being drafted by organizations like the OECD and UNESCO on the ethics of neurotechnology.
Let me use another analogy. A privacy floor is like a building code for a house. You can build a house however you want, paint it whatever color, but legally the building code dictates you must have fire alarms, you must have safe wiring, and the foundation must be structurally sound.
You cannot opt out of the baseline safety code. We need a building code for brain data.
A perfect analogy.
Yeah.
What does this proposed privacy floor require?
Several non-negotiable elements. First, dynamic opt-in consent. We have to end the era of pre-checked boxes hidden on page 47 of a Terms of Service agreement.
Users must explicitly opt in to highly specific types of cognitive biometric processing.
And the interface must allow them to revoke that consent instantly, at any time, without breaking the core functionality of the device.
It also requires strict purpose limitation, right?
Yes. That means if an AR application demands access to my eye tracking data, specifically to render a 3D environment correctly, it is legally barred from taking that exact same data stream and using it to gauge my emotional affective reaction to a virtual billboard I just walked past.
Furthermore, they advocate for the mandatory use of differential privacy, which injects statistical noise into datasets so individuals can't be identified, and advanced encryption methods for all stored biometrics.
But of all the solutions proposed, The most intriguing and technologically ambitious proposal mentioned in the sources is the concept of a brain-computer interface anonymizer.
Yes, I saw that in the final section. It sounds like a piece of hardware straight out of a William Gibson cyberpunk novel. What exactly is a BCI anonymizer?
It is currently a theoretical software framework, but as implants become common, it will likely become a physical intermediary piece of hardware. The core problem it solves is the signal separation issue.
The signal separation issue. Explain that.
It is incredibly difficult to separate the conscious brain signals you want to share with an app like the motor cortex command to move a digital cursor from the subconscious background noise of the brain that might accidentally reveal a hidden medical condition or a private emotional state.
Because both signals are firing simultaneously in the wetware.
Because the brain doesn't neatly organize its data into folders, everything is pulsing at once.
Exactly. So the anonymizer would sit as a firewall between your raw biological brain and the digital application.
It would utilize real-time frequency filtering. For example, conscious motor commands often appear as high-frequency beta or gamma bursts in specific regions. Emotional baseline states often present as slower theta or alpha waves radiating from the limbic system.
So the anonymizer AI would actively identify, filter, and physically strip out the slow, sensitive, identifying emotional waves from the signal stream,
Ensuring the app only ever receives the sterile high-frequency motor command. It fundamentally sanitizes your neural exhaust before it ever touches the digital world.
Okay, let's take a collective breath and summarize the incredibly vast amount of ground we have covered in this deep dive today. We started by mapping the biological visual assembly line of the brain from the V1 edge detectors to the higher-level object recognition centers.
We saw how scientists are utilizing hierarchical variational autoencoders to mirror that biological architecture.
Allowing them to literally decode the visual imagery of our waking lives and astonishingly reconstruct the video feed of our dreams. We examined Neuralink's highly aggressive 2026 roadmap, looking at the sub-millimeter robotic precision and nanometer manufacturing required to scale up automated brain surgeries.
Shifting BCIs from medical necessities into consumer augmentations like AR control and telepathic communication.
We grounded that futurism by looking at the incredible immediate healing potential of non-invasive tech, exploring how clinics are using acoustic echoing and immersive VR to essentially retune the dysregulated brainwaves of trauma patients.
And finally, we confronted the urgent existential battle to redefine our legal frameworks around cognitive biometrics.
Fighting to establish a privacy floor that protects our deepest mental sanctity from an industry that currently shares over 96% of our collected brain data.
It is a technological landscape defined by profound, almost overwhelming dualities. The exact same AI and hardware that can cure paralysis, restore sight, and soothe a deeply traumatized mind possesses the inherent capability to strip away the absolute last sanctuary of human privacy we have left our own internal thoughts.
The legal definitions and the architectural hardware choices we make right now in this decade, things like mandating edge computing and enforcing dynamic consent, will dictate the reality of the future we are all about to inhabit.
Which brings me to a final thought for you, the listener, to mull over as you go about the rest of your day. We just talked extensively about the brain-computer interface anonymizer.
This proposed highly advanced AI firewall that would sit permanently between our raw, chaotic human thoughts and the sterile digital world, constantly deciding which parts of our mind are safe or relevant to transmit.
If we successfully mandate technologies like this anonymizer to protect our privacy, do we inadvertently, fundamentally, alter our own digital identity?
Think deeply about it. In a rapidly approaching future where our thoughts directly and seamlessly control our digital and physical reality, if our thoughts are constantly being sanitized, filtered, and smoothed out by a protective AI before they ever reach the outside world, are we still truly ourselves out there?
Or are we just presenting a highly curated, algorithmically sterilized version of who we think we are?
That is the ultimate defining question of the neuro-digital age.
It really is.
Thank you for joining us on this incredibly expansive deep dive. Keep questioning the technology, keep questioning the world around you, and we will see you next time.